The rain hammered down in relentless sheets, pounding against the windshield like a drum roll, signaling trouble ahead. It was just after midnight, and the lonely stretch of I-90 outside Spokane, Washington, felt like a world unto itself. A narrow ribbon of slick asphalt weaving through towering pine trees and an endless shroud of darkness. The air outside was thick with the scent of wet earth and evergreen, though inside her beat-up Toyota, 28-year-old Captain Maya Torres could only hear the muffled roar of the storm. Her hazel eyes flicked to the dashboard clock, its green glow reading 12:03 a.m. She'd been driving for 150 miles, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she pushed through exhaustion, heading home after a grueling week at her Army base. The faint twang of a country song, some old Johnny Cash tune, crackled through the speakers, cutting through the steady hum of the engine. Dressed in a faded gray hoodie and olive green cargo pants, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, she looked like any other late-night traveler. Nothing about her screamed military captain. She blended into the shadows of the night, just another set of headlights cutting through the downpour, or so she thought. Then, like a sudden crack of thunder, red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror, slicing through the storm with a jolt that snapped her spine straight. Her gut twisted, a familiar knot tightening, not from fear, but from a bone-deep, weary kind of déjà vu. She'd been here before, more times than she cared to count. Those lights weren't just a signal to pull over. They were a challenge, a test she'd faced on highways from Texas to Virginia over her years in uniform. Her mind raced for a split second. Had she missed a speed limit sign? Was her tired brain playing tricks on her? No, she'd been careful, clocking a steady 60 miles per hour despite the rain-slicked road. With a slow breath, she flicked on her blinker, the amber light blinking like a heartbeat against the dark. She eased the Toyota onto the muddy shoulder, tires crunching over loose gravel as the car shuddered to a stop. Hands at 10 and 2, she waited, her posture drilled into her by years of discipline. The rain battered the roof, each drop a sharp tap that echoed in the silence of the cab. She kept her eyes forward, steady, though her peripheral vision tracked the movement behind her. Out of the patrol car stepped Officer Travis Keller, 42 years old, and built like a linebacker gone slightly to seed. His rain-slicked boots stomped toward her with a deliberate thud, cutting through the puddles pooling on the asphalt. He moved like he owned this stretch of highway, like the storm itself bent to his will. His flashlight beam sliced through the downpour, harsh and unyielding, painting the side of her car in a stark white glow. The light caught the edge of his badge, glinting briefly, but his face stayed shadowed under the brim of his hat. License and registration, he snapped, his voice gravelly and rough, carrying no trace of warmth or patience. Maya met his stare through the rain-streaked window, her hazel eyes locking onto his for a moment before she moved. She slid her documents from the center console with practiced ease, handing them over without a tremble. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her tone even, unshaken, though she already knew the answer didn't matter. Keller smirked, barely glancing at the papers as he held them in his gloved hand. "Headlights out," he said, his voice dripping with certainty. Her brow furrowed, a flicker of doubt cutting through her calm. "That's not possible. I checked it last week. You calling me a liar?" His eyes narrowed, daring her to push back, his stance shifting slightly, as if itching for a fight. The rain pounded harder, a wall of sound closing in. This wasn't about a headlight, not by a long shot. Maya knew this routine all too well, a choreography of control she'd learned to spot a mile away. At 28, her 6 years in the Army had schooled her in power games tougher than anything a rain-soaked cop could throw her way. She'd faced down drill sergeants screaming in her face at Fort Benning, navigated tense checkpoints and dusty outposts overseas, and once stared into the barrel of a rifle held by a jittery local who didn't like her uniform. Travis Keller, with his waterlogged ego and smug grin, didn't even register on that scale. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice steady as the calm at a storm center. "If my headlight's out, I'll get it fixed." "No big deal." "Get out of the car," Keller barked, his words slicing through her offer like a blade, sharp and impatient. She exhaled slowly, her breath fogging briefly in the chilly air as she peered through the rain-streaked windshield. The highway stretched empty before her, no headlights piercing the dark, no witnesses to this little drama. Just the silhouettes of pine trees swaying in the wind, their branches thrashing like they were cheering the storm on. "Why?" she asked, her fingers brushing the door handle before popping it open. The cold hit her like a slap as she stepped out, her combat boots sinking an inch into the muddy shoulder, water seeping through the laces. "'Cause I told you to," Keller shot back, his smirk flashing in the glow of his flashlight like he'd already chalked this up as a win in his head. She stood tall, all 5 feet 6 inches of her against his hulking 6 feet 2 inches frame, her posture loose but coiled, ready, not rigid. Years of training had taught her the difference between a fight worth picking and a trap to sidestep. She wasn't here to brawl in the mud, but she'd be damned if she'd grovel either. "Turn around, hands on the hood," he ordered, stepping closer, his boots squelching as the beam of his light danced across her soaked hoodie. "For what?" Her question hung in the air, simple but firm, cutting through the rain's steady roar. His smirk vanished, replaced by a hard line. "You resisting?" he growled, his voice dropping an octave, daring her to cross him. "No," she said, her tone unwavering, eyes locked on his. "I'm asking." His lip twitched, annoyance flickering there, maybe a spark of glee at the chance to escalate. He grabbed his radio, the static crackling as he muttered, "Got a problem driver here," his words low and clipped. Then, louder, he snapped, "Turn around." Her pulse thrummed in her ears, a steady drumbeat under the storm's chaos, but her face stayed cool, unreadable. "Officer," she said, her voice low and deliberate, edged with steel, "I know my rights, and I know yours too." That struck a nerve. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing like she'd just thrown a punch. "You're under arrest," he snarled, lunging for her arm with a quickness that caught her off guard. She sidestepped just enough, a half-inch dodge honed by muscle memory, keeping her free for a split second. "For what?" she pressed, her words sharp now, demanding. "Obstructing me," he spat, the cuffs glinting in the rain as he yanked them from his belt. So that was his play, twist her questions into defiance. Army instincts surged, breath steady, mind razor-sharp. She could fight now, risk it all in a muddy scuffle, or play it smart and fight later. With a slow turn, she placed her hands on the hood, rain soaking her hoodie through. Keller pounced, yanked her arms back, snapped the cuffs on tight enough to bruise her wrists, and shoved her toward his cruiser. "You're in over your head," she murmured, barely audible over the storm. He laughed, a harsh bark, slamming the door shut. "Sweetheart, I'm right where I belong." He couldn't have been more wrong, and he'd find out soon enough. The cruiser's back seat reeked of wet leather and stale coffee, a sour mix that clung to the air like a bad memory. The hard plastic seat dug into Maya's spine, pressing against her soaked hoodie with every bump, but she sat still, her breathing slow and deliberate, a rhythm she'd mastered under pressure. Her wrists throbbed under the cuffs, the metal biting into her skin too tight, no accident there. She flexed her fingers slightly, testing the restraint, feeling the sharp sting where the edges cut in. Outside, Keller swaggered back to the car, his silhouette framed by the rain-streaked window as his radio crackled with static, punctuated by a jagged bolt of lightning tearing across the sky. Through the scratched partition separating her from the front, she caught a reflection in the dim glow, calm, unshaken, a quiet fire smoldering in her hazel eyes. She'd faced worse than this. Desert patrols in 110-degree heat, the distant pop of IEDs echoing through sand-choked valleys, nights where sleep came only after checking every shadow for threats. Travis Keller? He was just a loudmouth with a badge, a small-time bully drunk on his own hype, nothing she hadn't handled before. Time crawled. 5 minutes bled into 10, each second marked by the steady drip of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder rolling over the pines. She shifted her hands again, the cuffs chafing her wrist raw, a deliberate jab from Keller she wouldn't forget. The driver's door swung open with a creak, and he slid in, rain dripping from his hat onto the seat. "Buckle up, princess," he sneered, his smug grin flashing in the rearview mirror as he twisted the key in the ignition. The engine growled to life, and the cruiser lurched back onto I-90, its red and blue lights cutting through the storm like a predator's glare. The highway stretched ahead, a slick black vein under the downpour, and Maya watched the world blur past, her mind steady even as her body ached. "Most folks," Keller said after a beat, his voice breaking the hum of the tires, "know to keep their damn mouths shut when I tell him to move." He glanced back through the mirror, fishing for a reaction, his tone dripping with condescension. Maya snorted softly, a sound barely audible over the rain. "And most cops don't cuff people for asking a simple question." Her words were measured, a quiet jab that landed square. He chuckled, a low, grating sound, shaking his head like she'd told a bad joke. "You think you're hot stuff, huh? Some big shot who's too good for this." "I don't think," she replied, her gaze locking onto his in the mirror, steady and unyielding. "I know." His knuckles whitened on the wheel, his jaw twitching like she'd flicked a switch. "Army," he guessed, his tone shifting, less cocky, more probing, like he was trying to size her up anew. She didn't answer, letting the silence stretch, her face a mask of cool defiance. "Figures," he muttered, filling the void himself. "Got that 'I'm better than you' vibe all over you. Bet you thought I'd back off once I sniffed that out, huh?" She let him ramble, his words bouncing off her like the rain on the windshield. Ahead, the station loomed into view, a squat brick building off the highway, its parking lot a desolate puddle under the storm's assault. "If you'd played nice," he said, his voice smug again, "we'd be done by now. You'd be home, dry, instead of here." Her lips pressed into a tight line, a flicker of anger sparking beneath her calm. The gall of this guy, blaming her for his power trip. She didn't respond, didn't need to. He'd see soon enough how wrong he was. The station hit Maya like a damp punch. Inside, the air was thick with the sour stench of mildew and a heavy, unspoken despair that clung to every surface. Keller hauled her through the booking process with rough efficiency, fingerprints smudged onto a pad, a mugshot snapped under harsh fluorescent light, the whole tired routine rolling out like a script these walls had seen 1,000 times. The desk cops barely glanced up, their yawns stretching wide as they shuffled papers and sipped lukewarm coffee from stained mugs. It was apathy so thick you could cut it, the kind that let men like Keller thrive, unquestioned, unchecked, free to flex their badges like crowns. He shoved her toward a cell at the end of the hall, the metal bars clanging shut with a hollow ring that echoed off the concrete. "Sleep tight," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery as he tapped the bars with a knuckle, a final taunt before strutting off, his wet boots leaving faint tracks on the floor. Maya sank onto the cell's bench, the cold steel biting through her rain-soaked clothes, seeping into her skin like an unwelcome guest. A single bare bulb buzzed overhead, its flickering light casting jagged shadows that danced across the cinderblock walls, gray and pitted with years of neglect. She'd camped in worse sandstorms that stung her face in the Iraqi desert, hostile zones where every rustle could mean a sniper's scope trained on her head. This was a hiccup, a minor snag in a life built on tougher threads. But it still burned, a slow simmer in her chest. Not just the injustice, but the sheer gall of Keller thinking he could write her story with a pair of cuffs and a smirk. Later, the silence broke. His boots echoed back down the hall, a deliberate, heavy rhythm she'd already memorized. He loomed outside the bars, leaning against them with his arms crossed, his bulk filling the frame. "Cozy?" he asked, his tone mocking, fishing for a crack in her armor. She stared through him, her hazel eyes steady, giving him nothing. "If you'd cooperated," he pressed, his voice lowering like he was sharing a secret, "you'd be home by now, tucked in nice and dry." A faint smile curled her lips, sharp and knowing. "I'm right where I need to be." His grin faltered, just a flicker, a hairline fracture in his confidence, before he patched it with a scoff. "No one's bailing you out tonight, tough girl." he said, shrugging like he'd already won the war. Better get comfy. Then, a new sound cut through, a younger voice, hesitant, edged with nerves. Officer Keller? Phone call. You gotta hear this. The kid, maybe 22, stood a few feet back, clutching a clipboard like a shield. Keller's head snapped around, irritation flashing, before he stomped off, his boots slapping the floor harder now. Maya tilted her head, listening. Fragments drifted back, mumbled words like lawyer, brass, a sharp, why she here, that hung in the air. The hall went quiet, then erupted again with his return, his steps heavier, angrier. He stormed into view, his swagger gone, fists balled tight at his sides, knuckles white. What did you do? He demanded, his voice a mix of rage and something new, uncertainty. Nothing, she said, leaning forward on the bench, her gaze locking onto his. But I've got friends who don't like bullies, and they've got louder voices than yours. His face twisted, a snarl caught between shock and dread. The game was up, and he knew it. The power he'd wielded like a club was slipping through his fingers, and Maya sat there, unshaken, watching it fall. Dawn crept over Spokane in a gray, damp shroud, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy with unspoken promises. Light filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the Spokane County Courthouse, spilling across the polished wood floors in pale streaks. Captain Maya Torres stood at the defense table, her wrists free of cuffs now, replaced by a crisp olive-green jacket and her muddy combat boots, cleaned up but still carrying the weight of the night before. At 28, her hazel eyes burned with a quiet steel, unyielding and focused, a stark contrast to the chaos that had landed her here. Beside her, her lawyer, Jenna Pierce, 35, moved with the precision of a surgeon, shuffling a stack of papers with quick, practiced hands, no small talk, no wasted motion, just a razor-sharp presence Maya respected from the moment they'd met. The courtroom buzzed faintly with the murmur of clerks and spectators settling in, the air tinged with the scent of old wood and fresh coffee. Across the room, Officer Travis Keller swaggered through the double doors, his chest puffed out like he still owned the place. At 42, he carried himself with the bravado of a man used to winning, but his eyes betrayed him, darting side to side, flickering with a nervousness he couldn't quite mask. Maya caught his gaze as he passed, her stare locking onto his like a missile finding its target. He flinched, a quick twitch of his shoulders, and looked away. Perfect. That crack in his armor was all she needed to know she'd already won half the battle. Judge Harold Grayson, 63, eased into his chair behind the bench, his weathered face etched with the exhaustion of decades in this room. He rubbed tired eyes beneath wire-rimmed glasses, his gray hair thinning at the crown, and let out a low grunt. "Let's move," he said, his voice gravelly, cutting through the hum like a gavel before the gavel even fell. The prosecutor, a wiry man in his 40s with a neatly pressed suit, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his tone clipped and confident, Captain Maya Torres was detained without cause. Officer Travis Keller's record shows a pattern of trouble, serious trouble. The room stirred, a ripple of whispers spreading through the gallery. Keller shifted in his seat, his broad frame tensing, his jaw tightening under the scrutiny. She wouldn't comply, he argued, leaning forward, his voice loud enough to carry but thin with defensiveness. The prosecutor didn't blink, holding up Maya's file like a trump card, Army veteran, commendations for valor, a record so clean it gleamed. Over a headlight, he shot back, his eyebrow arching as he let the absurdity hang in the air. Then came the bombshell. Keller's traffic stop skew hard toward minorities, disproportionately, consistently. The whispers swelled into a low roar, heads turning, eyes narrowing at the officer now sinking slightly in his chair. Judge Grayson leaned forward, peering over his glasses. "Show me the body cam," he ordered, his tone flat but firm, brooking no argument. A screen hummed to life at the front of the room, the footage rolling, Keller's barking commands, Maya's measured calm, the cuffs snapping tight around her wrist with a smug flourish. The audio caught every word, every inflection, painting the scene in stark relief. Silence crashed down when it ended, heavy and absolute. "Officer," Grayson said, his voice cutting through like a blade, "you broke the rules. Charges against Captain Torres are dismissed. Investigate him thoroughly." Keller's face flushed a deep, angry red, his fist clenching on the table, veins bulging. Maya just exhaled, a slow release of breath she'd held since mile 1 on I-90. She'd called it from the start, and now the courtroom knew it too. Travis Keller bolted from the courtroom like a man on fire, his heavy boots pounding the polished hardwood, each step a desperate echo down the corridor. Reporters swarmed like vultures, their cameras flashing and voices overlapping in a hungry chorus. "Officer Keller, any comment? What happened in there?" Their pens poised to carve his disgrace into tomorrow's headlines. He shoved past them, his face a mask of fury and sweat, until a firm hand clamped his shoulder in the hall. Chief Paul Hensley, 58, stood there, his weathered face unreadable under a shock of salt and pepper hair. Decades on the force had etched lines deep into his skin, but his gray eyes still cut like steel. "What the hell were you thinking, Travis?" he demanded, his voice low and rough, carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too many careers crash. "My job," Keller snapped, his breath ragged, defiance flaring in his chest like a cornered animal's snarl. Hensley didn't flinch. He tossed a thick file onto a nearby table, the thud sharp against the hum of the courthouse. "She's a captain, an army captain with a record cleaner than yours ever was. You're done. Suspended, effective now. Internal Affairs is already digging, and they're not gentle." His words landed like a sledgehammer, and Keller's fists clenched, knuckles widening. But he had no retort. The chief turned away, leaving him to stew in the wreckage of his own making. Across town, Maya Torres sat in a corner booth at the Rusty Spoon Diner, the rain tapping a soft rhythm against the fogged-up windows. She nursed a steaming mug of black coffee, its bitter warmth grounding her as the storm outside mirrored the one she'd just weathered. At 28, she'd faced plenty, combat zones, sleepless nights, the weight of command, but this felt different, raw. Her phone buzzed on the chipped Formica table, the screen lighting up with headlines screaming across news apps. "Captain wronged in traffic stop scandal. Cop out after courtroom clash." Another buzz, a text from Jenna Pierce, her lawyer. "Keller's toast. Suspension confirmed, charges pending." Maya nodded to herself, a quiet, "damn right," slipping past her lips as she took a slow sip, the coffee scalding her tongue just enough to feel real. Then the phone rang, a familiar number flashing. Her commanding officer, Colonel Danvers, his voice steady but tinged with something heavier. "Maya, the Pentagon's got eyes on this. It's big, bigger than you might think." She sighed, leaning back against the cracked vinyl seat, her hazel eyes tracing the raindrops racing down the glass. It wasn't just about her, never had been. It was about every kid pulled over for no reason, every voice silenced by a badge swung like a club, people who didn't have her rank, her fight, her luck. "Mayor's office called too," Danvers added, a hint of amusement breaking through. "They want to pin a medal on you. Courage under pressure," they said. She smirked, a dry chuckle escaping. "Maybe. We'll see." Outside, the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a red glow over the wet parking lot. A dad and his little girl darted from a pickup truck, splashing through puddles as she giggled, her rain boots kicking up water. He scooped her up, laughing, their joy cutting through the gray. Maya watched them, her chest tightening. That's who she'd fought for. Kids like that, growing up in a world where a badge should mean safety, not fear. She'd taken Keller down not just for herself, but for them, for every innocent face caught in the crosshairs of unchecked power. The rain kept falling, but for the first time all day, she felt the weight lift, just a little. That night, drenched in rain and cuffed for nothing, I learned a hard truth. Power doesn't yield unless you force it to. I could have stayed silent, let Keller bulldoze me into submission, but I refused. Standing firm, I watched him crumble, his badge, his swagger, all undone by my resolve. Life's littered with Kellers, folks convinced they're invincible, towering over the rest of us. But here's the real deal. They're not. They're only as strong as the silence they're given. I had a voice, and I used it, turning his game upside down. You've got one too, a voice that can shake the untouchable, rattle the arrogant, and demand what's right. It's not easy. The rain's cold, the cuffs bite, and the fight feels stacked against you. But that's the point. Pushing back when it's tough is how you shift the world. Not just for yourself, but for the kid down the street, the stranger in the next car, for all of us. So speak up, stand tall, and don't flinch. That's how you build something better, one defiant step at a time.